Okay, welcome back. Lesson 16. We now finally unveil the final principal part, the sixth principal part, which for most verbs has the characteristic theta, eta, new ending, the thane ending, which you're used to just from reciting these. Okay, and then typically the declension will be thane, thase, they, thamen, thete, theson in the case of the aorist passive. And then for the case of the future passive, thesamai, these, thesatai, thesamatha, thesate, thesontai. Okay, so in other words, this sixth principal part is all about forming the aorist in future passive. That's what it exists for. Okay. Now, of course, there are a few verbs that we have seen, and we'll see a few more throughout the course, where there won't be the theta ending, but no matter, you still conjugate these verbs exactly the same way. Okay, so for instance, eluthane, eluthase, eluthe, eluthemen, eluthete, elutheson. Okay, so pretty straightforward in terms of that. You have a nice theme vowel. The eta persists throughout, and that makes it pretty easy to remember. Okay, for the future passive, I should note actually for that when you're forming that, let's write this out here. Eluthane. Okay, so eluthane would be your first one. This is the aorist passive. Okay, so eluthe. Thase will be your second here. Okay, eluthe, and so forth. Okay, so that's your aorist passive, eluthemen, eluthete, elutheson. But for your future passive, one thing you need to note here is that there's no augment. The augment goes away. Okay, the augment goes away, and then you also have these second endings. So you have luthesamai. Okay, luthese. Okay, and this is a subscript too. Okay, and luthesatai. Okay, and then the plural you have luthesamatha. Okay, I'm not worried about accenting these so much now at this stage, but these, sate. Okay, luthesate, and finally luthesontai. Okay, so just be aware of that. You don't have the epsilon augment there for the future passive. That's just a little thing you have to remember. But other than that, these are actually fairly easy to remember. These forms are, that is. Okay. Now, given that, we should note a couple of things in practice. Okay. The one thing I wanted you to point out is that, strictly speaking, the sixth principal part is originally meant to be strictly passive. Now, I say that because, in fact, the New Testament writers break that rule all the time, and in fact, the classical writers did too. This is not really totally unique in that regard. So, sixth principal part very frequently for deponent verbs, okay, especially common deponent verbs like ginomai, the word to be or to become, or apokrinomai, the word to answer, poieuomai, dunamai, poieuomai to go, dunamai to be able to. Very often you'll see the sixth principal part still having a basically middle sense. Okay, so for instance, to say he answered, okay, strictly speaking, we would want what? Apokrin, amen. Okay, why? Because that's your aorist form, apokrinomen. That's your aorist middle form. Okay, but for a deponent verb. But in fact, what we usually find for he answered is what? Apokrithen. Apokrithe. Okay, Jesus answered very frequently apokrithe. Now, why do we see that when this form is supposed to be strictly passive? Okay, don't know. You just do. Okay, it's one of those little quirks that you have to get used to. Okay, so in fact, you parse it as a passive, but it really has a middle sense. Okay, And this is one of those rare exceptions to the rule that the sixth principal part is strictly passive. Okay, it's not in practice. Okay, it never means he was answered, for instance, but always he answered. Okay, and Ginomai is the same way. Okay, Eganethe, you see the same thing, he became. Okay, that's not at all unusual. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now notice also, now that we know something about these tenses, we're now in a position to actually see some ways in which they're used, okay, and the nuances that they convey. Remember, I told you the difference between the aorist and the perfect was that the aorist is primarily about facts, okay, about things having happened or things happening in reality in the present, okay, not necessarily in an ongoing way, but just more the fact of action, okay, whereas perfect is what? That's more the present state of affairs derived from current action, from past action. Okay, so for instance, you can see how this works here. Here's what the Pharisees say in John 29. They say, Oidemen hati mose erike hatheas. Okay, meaning what? We know that God erika, that God spoke to Moses or has spoken to Moses. Now, what's that a statement of? Is that a statement of fact? No. Okay, why? Because we see Erika here. Lelalika is actually the word that they use, but Erika is basically the same thing. I just stuck it in there because you haven't seen the other word yet. Okay, but the point is that they're using a perfect tense here. That's not so much conveying the fact of God's revelation to Moses, but what? The fact that they consider that fact to be normative in the present time. Okay? In other words, this really says something about God in the present time, that he's the God now of having spoken to Moses. Okay? In other words, what he said to Moses is still relevant for us today. Okay? That's the sense of the perfect, that the perfect carries force into the present tense. Okay? This is more of a statement about divine authority in the state of affairs than anything else. Okay, it's not so much the fact of divine revelation as it is the normative force of divine revelation today. And this is, hits on the basic debate between Jesus and the Pharisees, debating over who really is speaking for God. Is it the Pharisees who convey the words of Moses, or is it Jesus who reveals from the Father? Okay, so you can see how very much the grammar here itself conveys senses that are difficult to convey in a translation. Now, compare this to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Okay, and then the famous section of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. There's a whole section where Jesus goes through these "you have heard it said, but I say to you," okay, expression. You have heard it said X, but I say to you Y. Okay, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you, whoever looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery in his heart. Okay, so in other words, he's sort of building on the law, interpreting the law, or really, in effect, positing himself as the new normative authority in terms of revelation. But notice the grammar here and how this comes across. Okay, here's what he says. Ekusate, okay, so in other words, you have heard what? Hati erethe. Okay, erethe is the sixth principal part of Lego. So you have heard that what? That it was said. Okay, but I am saying to you now. Okay, ego lege de humin. Okay, now, so what's the point here? Well, look at the tense here. Erethe, that's an aorist passive. Okay, why does he use the aorist passive? Because he's now only hitting at the fact of previous utterances, not so much at their normative authority today. Okay, if he wanted to say that, he'd use the perfect. Okay, but the perfect wouldn't fit in well with his purposes because he's in effect relativizing what was said in the past to now what he's giving in the future, okay, in the present tense, okay, as being the new sort of normative, definitive revelation. Okay, this is really, really unique. Okay, so you can see here that Jesus is only saying, relegating past utterances literally to the past, okay, through the aorist. this was said as a matter of fact, but I'm saying to you now something different. Okay, that's the real distinction between the two tenses, between the aorist here, okay, and the perfect. Okay, if he wanted to stress the sort of normative authority of what was said in the past as having still definitive weight today, he would have used the perfect, but he used the aorist instead. Okay, this is how grammatical analysis is actually very, very important in understanding the nuances, which really can't be that well translated. Okay, so if you want to understand these texts, you're doing the grunt work, the heavy lifting, which is going to pay off grammatically. Okay. Well, once again, I gave you some new principal parts here. I'll leave you to wrestle with those yourself. Have a very, very good week.